Hello, everybody, and welcome to the 197th edition of the Frank and Stan chat. And those of you watching on video, because this does go out as a podcast as well, will see that we have a guest who's been with us before, Professor Mel Ainscow. So, good morning, Mel.
Good morning, and it's very nice to be back with you, and I look forward to the conversation.
Yeah, well, we have no idea where this conversation is going to lead. I think one thing, though, that I think Stan and I will definitely be referring to is your latest book, which is it's called Developing Inclusive Schools. And one of the great things, Mel, about doing these chats is it does force you to do more reading. I
Oh,
probably wouldn't have read that book if I didn't know you were coming on. And I think it's sort of like part of our professional development
so you were
process.
waiting for the film, were you?
Well, we were. Or the can you run a little 5 minute slideshow which captures it all? Yeah, because it covers a lot of ground. It really does. But we'll get onto that in a minute. So, how are you, Stan?
Good. Cold, but with a promise of it getting warmer, I think, towards the next week.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
but the heating came on today for the first time ever. So that's that's really a sign that autumn's here.
Mm. I don't cope very well with this sort of period. I get quite sort of down on it, you know what I mean? Because you think the nights are closing in, it's getting cool. But anyway, Mel, thank you for coming back. And you were last on in February 2023. And from memory, because I haven't looked at that video recently, there were some little sort of miniature sort of ornaments or something behind your desk, which you were getting from an airline or something. Do you remember it?
KLM, yeah, my
KLM.
favorite airline. Yeah, yeah.
Um,
That's your abiding memory of the event, was
well,
it?
of course, yeah.
Nothing else
I was
stuck,
hoping,
Mal. Nothing
I
else
was,
stuck.
I was hoping we'd have that image again. Yeah, but
Oh, I'm in a different place.
yeah.
I have two homes, so that's part of it.
All right.
We
Well,
overlap.
Mel, what have you been up to? Well, first of all, explain who you are and what you do, and then explain some of the work you've been doing more recently.
Yeah, okay. Well, I'm now Emeritus Professor of Education, which sounds very impressive, but it simply means I'm old and knackered. But briefly, my career is I spent a lot of time as a teacher. I was a failed art teacher in secondary schools. Then I was in special education. I was a head teacher of a special school. And then mid-career, when nobody was watching, I managed to get myself into the University of Cambridge. And I spent 10 years at the University of Cambridge. And the relevance of that, I'm now at the University of Manchester, of course. And the relevance of that is that going into the academic world, having had a real job, of course, I had a big adjustment to make, but I also took lots of issues and agendas with me, which, of course, the space of universities allowed me to explore, really. So my work has developed since I went into universities around the idea of working with education systems and schools, around how to make schools more inclusive and equitable. And as part of that work, for a long time, I've also been a consultant to UNESCO. So that's allowed me to work with school systems in many different parts of the world, all over the world, really. They used to call me the Air Miles Professor at the university. Um, and I'm
This is
still
where the
traveling.
KLM thing came in, is it?
Yeah, that's right. And I'm still traveling. I was in Italy last week for a conference, and I'm going to Norway on Sunday, so I'm still on the move. But the book that you mentioned is, in a sense, a kind of biography, really.
Yeah.
Briefly, what happened was in 1999, I wrote a book, which I'm still very proud of, called Understanding the Development of Inclusive Schools. And at that time, I'd done quite a lot of work internationally and also in the UK. And after that book, I then developed a whole series of projects and, kind of sort of research studies. And so I went back to the publisher 2 years ago and I said, what about a second edition? And they weren't terribly excited about that. And I chatted with various colleagues and they weren't either. And they said, second editions are a killer, really. But so I decided to write a new book. So the new book, in a sense, traces what I've done in different parts of the world, including here in England, since 1999. And as you'll have seen, the book is full of stories.
Yes.
Uh, and it's interesting, in the preface, I mentioned that one of my colleagues said to me some months ago, all you do is tell stories. And I thought it was a criticism. Maybe it was. I thought it would be, but I thought about it as I was writing this book, and I thought, well, that's true. And I mean, I because I'm in the field, I'm in classrooms, I'm in schools, I'm in meetings. I hear stories, and I'm pretty good at retaining them. So in the book, I tell quite a lot of stories, a kind of anecdotes, accounts of schools, accounts of classrooms. I mean, I don't know how you guys found it, but for me, that brings it to life.
Yeah.
And I mean, clearly there is theory in the book, but for me, theory without practice, theory doesn't connect to the real world. It's very nice in the university library, but that's all it does really. So the book, I think, is a combination of bits of theory, of lots of experience and research and development, and then these stories that try to bring it alive for the reader.
Yeah.
I think stories are really powerful. I think we forget that probably most of our knowledge started as people telling stories about what they said.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
I do think when you're reading a book, when you've got examples and pictures and stories of what
yeah,
people have done, that's the bit that sticks because you
yeah,
can retell that bit. You
yeah,
can't necessarily retell the research and the
no,
detail into it, but you can say, and as a result,
yeah, yeah,
this happened.
I mean, I'm intrigued to know because I've known you probably, well, it must be about 20 years, 15 years, something like
yeah,
that. This, I mean, when you were developing this sort of equitable side of, considering this as perhaps as a researcher, what actually triggered that in was it your experience as a special school head, or was it something
yeah.
that happened over time after that when you had a little bit of time to sort of reflect on
Well,
your
Phillips,
sort of,
I'm writing something else at the moment, and it's partly because of the account I'm trying to give. I'd partly traced that story, and what happened was after I'd been the head teacher of a special school, I became a local authority advisor in Coventry in the West Midlands, and my title there was advisor for special educational needs. That was my specialism. But as part of my job as an advisor, I also had a group of primary and secondary schools where I
yeah,
was the advisor on school development. And I mean, it was all that really that made
right,
me think this sort of stuff that I was doing in special schools, very individualized, very labor intensive, it's just not feasible, certainly in a large secondary school. So we developed I say we, because I always work with other people, I don't do anything on my own. We developed a kind of a citywide professional development program, which we call the Special Needs Action Program, SNAP. And in that, once we started to work with the secondary schools, that was where my kind of paradigm shift occurred, really, because I started to think all this stuff I've done before just is not feasible. But then when I started to work with colleagues in the schools, particularly the secondary schools, actually, I realized that all of this. Well, one of the things that I worked on that is still very much used internationally is a thing called the Index for Inclusion. And it's a framework for assessing everything that happens in the school. And when we were field testing that index, actually with some schools here in the Northwest, I left it one time with the deputy head of a secondary school, and I said, I'll come back in a couple of weeks and we talk about it. So I went back and I said, so what do you think about our index? How useful are we with you? And he said to me, the only thing is it's about everything. And I said, that's right.
that's right. Yeah,
Inclusion is about everything. It is about a transformation. In the book, I call it an inclusive turn. It's looking at the situation in a completely different way. So it's not about fixing children. It's not what's wrong with the child. Can we fix them? That's the old model. That's the deficit thinking of special education from where I came. It's actually about asking questions. Why are we failing to teach all our children effectively? Why are we failing to have some children attend school and participate and behave appropriately? So the concept that's central to everything I work on now, and it's there in the book, is the concept of barriers. As I say, I'm not talking about barriers within children or within families. I'm talking about contextual barriers. I'm talking about the curriculum. Is it designed with all children in mind? I'm talking about the assessment system. Does it celebrate the progress of every child, some of whom are making slow progress? Is it about the way we plan and teach the lesson?
mm,
Do teachers have the skills to actually plan a lesson where all the children can feel that they are valued and can take part? And of course, it's about things in our minds. Our expectation is what is possible. So really, my argument is the focus on inclusion and equity, and I include equity because that's part of the Sustainable Development Goal 4. And the concept that we use in UNESCO when I do work there is the idea every learner matters and matters equally. That's the fundamental principle that we're talking about. So what I'm addressing is not a peripheral matter. It's not a separate matter. It's at the center of the way education systems do their business. And sometimes when I meet, usually in other countries, with senior civil servants or even ministers occasionally, I say to them, don't have a policy for inclusion. And I can see people, in their seat. Don't have a policy. If it's a policy, it's going to be somebody's job. You take responsibility for inclusion. It's not going to be somebody's job. It's got to be everybody's job.
Yeah.
It's got to be a principle. The idea of inclusion, every learner matters and matters equally, is the principle, but he has to inform what happens. Now, that has implications for the crisis we're facing in the English education system, where clearly there are so many children out of school, there are so many children excluded, there's so many children we don't even know where they are. We need a transformative agenda. We need an inclusive turn. And I think there are lessons in the English education system. The system has moved dramatically over the last 20 years. You have to ask yourself, why has it moved? What are the levers that have brought about change? And I'd suggest you, and you guys are familiar with this as well, that what gets measured gets done.
Yeah.
And what we've done is we've fallen into a trap. We value what we can measure. And some things are relatively easy to measure, like test scores and attendance and so on. So we have to use that lever, and we have to say, don't let's value what we can measure. We have to measure what we can value. When I work with education systems, I say, let's have clarity about the principle of what you're trying to achieve, and then let's look at your systems for assessing and identifying progress. It's not just about children, it's about practice, it's about school organization, and of course it's about national policies regarding the curriculum, teacher education, funding, all the factors which can be levers for change. So that's why I suppose over many years now, I've drifted beyond just working with teachers and schools to addressing the question, how can we bring about systemic change?
Yeah. I mean, how much of an outlier are we in terms of the international sort of picture? I mean, are we sort of like mainstream and?
No, we're outlier. We're an outlier, and that's the worry, because for really 3 decades, much of the world has looked to England. I remember being in Australia. I do quite a lot of work in Australia. I remember being at a conference 20 years ago, and I met one of my colleagues from an Australian university, and I said, I've been listening to presentations from English colleagues, and I said, it's absolute madness. This is 20 years ago. And he said, it is. He said, but it's still the most exciting place in the world because it's a place of innovation. But we are an outlier, particularly in relation to marketization. I mean, the other outliers are, in no particular order, Chile, Sweden, parts of the United States, not all of the United States. And in all of those places, the common factor is fragmentation, competition, segregation. And of course, as measured by PISA, often kind of significant improvements, which people say, look, it's working.
Yeah.
The outlier as well, another outlier, which I refer to in chapter 10 of the book, if you haven't been that far yet,
No, I haven't actually.
It's Portugal. Now,
you've mentioned this before, actually.
Yeah, Portugal, and I spent a lot of time there, and I have done since 1995. It's a wonderful example of what's possible. I'm not saying everything's perfect, it's not, and it is a relatively small country. But what they've done over many years is they've made the idea of inclusion and equity the central principle of their policy. And they had changes in government, but the same principle is there. And as a result of that, almost all children in Portugal go to the local neighborhood school. There's very little private education. There's some in Lisbon and some in Porto, but almost everybody goes to the local school. The schools are relatively autonomous. They have quite a lot of autonomy, but they're all in clusters. They're all in area clusters. The head teachers are elected for 4 years by the community, and then they may be elected for another 4 years, but then they can't do it anymore. The central idea, and I've heard the minister say it in Portugal, and I've heard teachers say it, is you don't have to label to intervene. You don't have to categorize to intervene, right? Now, if you put that on a continuum, Portugal is over here and England is over there. We have so much labeling. It's not just about special needs and all that deficit stuff. We've got premium pupils. We've got, I don't know, all the different labels I hear teach. It's kind of endemic in the system, really. So I think England is fascinating because of the movement that's occurred. but is potentially catastrophic in terms of its influence on the rest of the world. And when I'm talking at conferences in other parts of the world, I'm kind of embarrassed really, because I want to be loyal, don't I? As a loyal Englishman. But I don't want to say don't come to England unless you want to learn what not to
But
do.
you say, but I've done a lot of work in Wales and I'm doing a lot of work in Scotland at the moment. Is that the way
Yes.
around it?
And
Yeah.
of course, Wales, I have, and I'm very much involved in Scotland at the moment, and the two couldn't be more different, really. I mean, Scotland is incredibly centralised. Uh, in some senses, very inclusive because most kids go to a local school, but sadly, it's completely stuck.
Mm.
It's highly centralised. Everything comes down from Edinburgh. The local authorities are the kind of delivery arm. And of course, the school leaders, who are pretty well paid as they are in England, have virtually no space for innovation. So whereas the mess that we're in England is a kind of context for innovation. And I mean, some of the schools I work with are doing wonderful things.
Yeah.
Some of the mats I work with are doing wonderful things, So we've somehow got to kind of bring order to the chaos in order that the strengths can be built upon. But it will require a massive rethink of national policy, curriculum, assessment, and of course, the inspection process, which you guys are often interested in.
Yeah. I'm not going down that. I'm not taking that bait today.
All right.
I'm going to get that buzzer out. But Stan?
It's addressing the one that we never seem to address, though, is it? And that's what's the purpose of our education system?
Yes. Yes.
That's the question. We've now got another curriculum review.
Yes.
I can't see that moving very far from where we are, because it's not going for the main thing. What are we teaching, and why are we teaching it, and what outcome do we want?
Well, I'm old enough to remember when the national curriculum was introduced, and there was a consultation over August, I remember.
Yeah.
And nobody asked the question, or your question, Stan, what is it for?
Yeah.
And in the absence of that debate, what it became for was test scores.
Yeah.
And what drives the curriculum, as I said earlier, what gets measured gets done. So I think in England, we have to review the purpose of education. I agree with that, and develop a curriculum which is appropriate to that. And we need to then reconsider the process of assessment and accountability within the system, because they are powerful levers of change. But we also have to invest in teachers. Teachers are the answer. Teachers are policymakers. As far as the children are concerned, it's what happens in the classroom that matters. And if you don't take teachers with you, then you're going to struggle. And I mean, successive governments have not taken teachers with them. And hence now, of course, we're having a problem with enrollment because people don't want to be teachers. It's had such a bad publicity. But for me, at the center of any reform has to be an investment in teachers and their professional learning.
Yeah. Do you think, I mean, they talk about a crisis in special educational needs at the moment, and in a way, does it get to a point though where the crisis is unmanageable? People accept that we can't continue down this road. I think probably the current government are thinking about that with the NHS. That saying we can't just continue to pump loads of money in here. There needs to be some sort of recalibration of the service and what it's about. Do you think that SEND is an opportunity? The issues around that, an opportunity to reframe what education is for all children, and how that is played out so that children do stay more in their local school. It gets to a crisis point, suddenly everything's possible when you're in a crisis.
No, I do think that. And I mean, I often argue that this, as I said earlier, this is about excellence. We want to create an excellent education system. And looking at the barriers that are experienced by children who are missing out opens the door. That's the subtitle of the title of the book is Pathways to Success. Finding the pathways. But in terms of that policy regarding the funding of children categorized as having special needs, I'm picking my words very carefully. I don't know where you'd start. It is such a total mess. And you can't sort of change it overnight, because today's children only have today, and today's parents have the dilemmas of saying, how can I get the best for my child? And of course, somebody comes along, an educational psychologist or a specialist, special needs, and they say, the best thing is for your child to go to this other place. And as a parent, I'd probably take the same thing, But the truth of the matter is that's why the system is now completely trapped in that way of thinking. And it needs a root and branch change, and it would have to be introduced carefully over time. But sooner or later it'll have to happen. I mean, the financing of all of that now is a complete and total mess.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I feel for parents really who are
Yeah.
trapped in
Yeah.
all of this.
Yeah.
Well, do you find that in your research that primary schools are better at inclusivity than secondaries?
Yes, I think that's true. I work with I've been working with a network, a MAT. It's actually a faith-based MAT, and they have a very inclusive philosophy. And I was in one classroom, year six, a few months back, and sitting at the back was this rather large black boy, and at one moment he stood up and he walked out, and the teaching assistant went with him. And so afterwards, I asked about this, and she said, well, about 2 or 3 times a day, he walks around the school and he puts his head against every classroom door. That's all. And then he comes back and gets on with his work. And, we just have to accept that's something he needs to do. But their great worry was he's from an immigrant family, he only is an only mother, and she's really struggling with some of the characteristics of this boy. The big worry is when he goes to secondary school, will they tolerate that rather idiosyncratic behaviour? Again, I understand in a school of 1,000 children and so on, that sort of thing is difficult. But I mean, tolerating our varied differences is part of the human condition, I think, isn't it?
The reason I ask is my experience of certain children that worked in the community of our school, I know didn't survive the first year in secondary
Oh, that's right.
and
Oh,
ended up in special school or
yeah.
ended up lost in the system.
Or out of school altogether.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
No, that's right. So I don't underestimate the changes in secondary schools. But in the book, I give quite a few examples of school development in secondary schools. And of course, a lot of that then focused on issues of leadership. And we did a lot of work using a kind of action learning approach with groups of head teachers, including some head teachers from special schools. And we saw how a collaborative form of professional development in a network of school leaders was one way to get them to think about how to address these things, which are dilemmas. There isn't a right answer. There's, on the one hand, on the other hand, and somehow you have to get on with it, don't you? But I think, I'm a very, in the book again, I'm very committed to networking and partnerships because I think they then open up a space for mutual support, but also provide a stimulus for thinking about what we're doing and what else we might be doing. In the networks I work with at the moment, well, you mentioned I work in Scotland. The project we're doing in the city of Dundee, we've been doing it now for over 3 years, is called Every Dundee Learner Matters. And it's an attempt to transform the way a system which is very stretched and has a very bad record in terms of equity, there's a lot of poverty in the city. What we try to do is to create all sorts of networks so that schools are learning from one another. So all the schools and the nurseries in Dundee are in trios made up of schools that don't normally collaborate. They have the clusters as well, that's very important. But these are for the purpose of professional development. And one of the things that we've introduced there, based on work we've done in other projects, is where they do what we call peer inquiry, which is a form of peer review, if you will. So typically what happens on a morning, and sometimes I shadow these things, two school leaders will visit the third school. They'll have an introduction about what the issues are the school is facing, and then they'll spend time walking around the school, learning walks, if you will, observing bits of lessons, talking to children, talking to teachers. And then at the end of the morning, they come together, the three head teachers, and they reflect on what's happened and what it means for the whole school, but what it means for the two visiting schools.
Yeah.
Now, these are incredibly powerful learning experiences. I sit there sometimes in awe when I listen to these very experienced people who understand it in a way I don't, and then share ideas, really. There was a wonderful example. I was at one school. These schools are all fairly disadvantaged, and they did the peer inquiry day. And when they sat down for their reflection at the end of the day, one of the head said, I realised, she said, watching your nursery classes, that the children don't talk unless there's an adult with them. They just get on with their play or activity, but they don't talk. They come from backgrounds where they're not used to talking. And she said, that's what happens in my school. And it was like, it's a mirror, having seen it in another school. I mean, these are subtle things which often are not talked about. That's part of the barrier, again, that I talk about in the book, is that the expertise of practitioners, teachers, and senior leaders is not articulated. People are too busy doing what they're doing. When you say to them, you see, I watch lots of lessons, and usually at the end of a lesson, I'll sit down with the teacher and I'll say, look, be clear, I'm not an inspector. This is not performance management. I'm trying to learn about your practice. And then I go through my notes and I say, I saw you do this, I heard that, and so on. And when I do that, particularly with experienced teachers, they say, I don't remember doing that. Did I do that? And of course, what it reminds people like me and you probably in the twilight zone of the education system is how bloody tough it is being a teacher. There isn't time to think. There isn't time to talk. There's nobody to talk to anyway because you've got the classroom with the door closed. So part of the rationale that we've been exploring over many years now is actually to open classroom doors. Teachers have got to see each other teaching, to listen to the views of children, to get an insight into what it's like to be a learner in this school, in this classroom, and then to have opportunities to see practice in other schools that stimulates reflection, I suppose, and then occasionally innovation. So, I mean, going back to the situation in England, I do think, you know, I mixed views about the multi-academy trust model, but we can't go back on it now.
No.
And I mean, I think my instinct would be to get every school in the country into some kind of partnership. I don't think they have to be businesses.
I think also
And
outside of their normal
yeah, and within
sort of,
that,
trust
yeah,
arrangements, because I think there's
yeah,
a risk about a sort of closed mindset
yeah, yeah,
in the trust that
yeah,
could sort of steer people down a route
yeah,
which, they may feel, there's perhaps an alternative route that's not being
yeah,
considered.
yeah, yeah. And I mean, in that, you're absolutely right, that Frank. I mean, in that difference, if it can be mobilized, is an invitation to innovate. Equally, difference can be a reason to sit together and say, what else can we do? You know, we've got all these children, we've got all this policy and so on. But, there's always space, the nearer you get to the classroom level, for innovation. And I mean, much of my work is about that. And I do think, there is a role for, I use the word in a kind of general way, for research, to create a system and a school where everybody, we talk about an inquiring school. I remember years ago, one of the schools we worked on with a network here in Greater Manchester, and I visited the school, and the head teacher said, she was part of a network we created, and she said, I want to show you our school development plan. And I sunk in my chair, I love school development plan. But she showed me, it was quite short, and then she explained there were no targets, there were no priorities, there were just questions. And she said, over the next 12 months, our school, together as a community, we're going to address these questions. The notion of an inquiring school, a school where it's constantly seeking new ways of reaching the children we're not reaching at the moment. That's the pathway to excellence, I think.
Do you know what was a brilliant piece of work? And Frank will cringe at this. The very first frameworks had all the questions laid out. And I took those questions out of Ofsted and said to schools, right, you're talking about behaviour in your school. Here's a set of questions you can sit down with the staff and discuss. And you don't need to do anything else, because by answering those questions, you'll change the way you operate. Why is it that this is happening now and it didn't used to happen? Was a classic question. And teachers knew the answer, but couldn't. Well, didn't have the authority in some schools to make the changes, or didn't think it was up to them to make the changes. But in a staff conversation why is it the children run around on the corridors and they never used to?
Yeah.
Well, is that because we used to stand out on the corridors when they came in?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, we used to do that, didn't we? No, well, we don't do that anymore. Why don't? And it was that kind of conversation that changed practice, rather than somebody with a clipboard going around and saying, I've noticed this, this, and this.
Well, a couple of stories that are in the book. There's one, we've worked with networks of schools in England as well as other places. And one of the projects we worked for 5 years with all the secondary schools in one local authority on the other side of the Pennines. And we set up staff inquiry school groups in each of the schools. And to give you the flavour, in one school, they decided, the staff inquiry group, that attendance was the problem. So they decided they were going to talk with groups of kids, particularly kids who didn't attend very regularly. They did focus groups, discussion, they did flip charts and so on. And of course, they tried to ask them the question, why don't you come to school every day? And they thought they were going to hear about poverty, unemployment, transport problems. Really, the only answer was because the lessons are boring.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Absolutely.
the following year, there was a big staff development program that they led with our help around how to make lessons more engaging and interesting. In another school in the same area, a very highly regarded school, a comprehensive school, but one of the very popular schools, the staff inquiry school had this hunch that there were some children who were disconnected. So they looked at all the students in year 9 and they looked at the statistical data that was available around rewards and punishments. And they found that something like 40% of the students hardly ever got a reward or hardly ever a punishment. So they started looking at who these kids were, and their hunch was these would be low achieving children. Some of them are amongst the highest achieving students in the year group. We then did some interviews, group interviews, and we helped them from the university. But we also did some observations, and you could pick these kids out in the lessons because they never spoke.
Mm.
Then we interviewed some of the students, and they said, "Well, I don't think anybody in the school knows my name."
Yeah.
Because none of the teachers ever call my name. And you start to think, are these kids included? Well, yes, they come every day. They do their homework. They're well behaved. They're there, but they're kind of on the margins. The teachers talked about these as being the invisible students. These are the invisible students.
Yeah.
And I've told that story to lots of kind of teachers in different parts of the world, you know. And when I'm saying it, I can see people going, yeah,
Yeah.
you know, yeah, we've got invisible students.
I collect. I mean, it's interesting because actually you make a lot of your points through stories, Mel. It's just come over very strongly in this chat. But I dropped my granddaughter off at a secondary school near here, and there are. It appears that some of the children are obsessed with getting badges, so they come with these badges on their lapels, you know, on the blazers. And I asked my granddaughter, why haven't you got any badges? You know, because literally they're weighed down with badges, and my granddaughter has none. And I'm thinking to myself, well, when she explained the reasons, you know, I think she's probably not one that's always going to have her hand up. She always does her homework, but she's sort of like one of those hidden,
invisible children.
Hidden children. And you think, and actually you get to a point then when you think, well, actually it's a badge of honor not to have a badge. You know what I mean? I'm going to be badge free for the rest of my school life, you know. But in a way, I don't think the school realizes this. It's not really reflected on something which it was trying to do positively to reward, you know, good effort and whatever. But it's not reflected on, well, what's the negative aspect to this? Who's not part of this program? Who's not benefiting from it?
That's why I promote the idea of the inquiring school.
Yeah.
Where we take, you know, kids who've not got badges and find out from them, what do you feel about that? How are you experiencing? You see, going back to the school where the invisible students are, we interviewed some students who were clearly invisible. Most of them were girls, interestingly. And like I remember one girl saying to me, she said, I get on my work and occasionally put my hand up and I wait and the teacher never comes. And then I see the teacher coming towards me, but then just before they get to me, something happens over in the other corner and off she goes, you know. And I think, you know, as you know, teenagers are very concerned with fairness.
Yes.
These kids were angry, really. They were angry, and rightly so. They're equal members of the school. So that's why I'm saying when I'm talking about inclusion, I'm really saying we get close to the situation. Why has this pupil not got any badges? What does it tell us? And it is creating this notion of an inquiring school.
Stan?
I asked the same question slightly differently, in that I noticed as a head some mainly boys who were generally poorly behaved at times being praised in assembly when they'd managed a day without being in trouble.
That's right. Exactly.
And they're at the front and getting applause from the whole school. And you look round and this, it's not supposed to be sexist, but lots of girls who work hard every day, who never get into trouble, they never stand at the front of assembly and get a clap. And we try and do something about it, I have to say.
Just to finish that bit off, Frank, you might remember a school in Stockport, secondary school, and the head teacher realised that lots of kids had the badges, and a lot of the teachers started to say, we don't have badges. So she introduced badges for the teachers.
Do you know what? we have nearly had 35 minutes and we haven't done what's caught your eye. So what I intend to do, Stan, is not doing that today.
Okay.
So one, just if I may, we've got about a couple of minutes. In the book, it talks about, and I think you probably have answered this, about gaining consensus amongst staff. So, leadership, needs to present these sorts of this thinking to a body, a staff
Yeah.
body. But of course, if you're trying to do that on your own, you
Yeah.
might be fortunate in having a group of staff who are right behind you. You've got one
Yeah.
or two key players who are on your side, who influence
Yeah.
those who don't want to get involved in it. But of course, having other schools within your network,
Yeah.
perhaps not within your local environment, actually it's
Absolutely.
quite helpful
It
in head
is.
teachers being able to say, well, look, we're not alone. We're on this journey with others, and one of them might be perhaps a more favoured school in a posher part of the town.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
actually, that's quite helpful, isn't it, in being able to use that as a vehicle for
Yeah.
persuading others to get involved.
I mean, that was, I worked briefly on London Challenge with Tim, and then I then led the Greater Manchester Challenge, and of course, we worked with whatever it was, 1,300 schools across the 10 local authorities, and we had them in families of schools
Mm,
that were deliberately designed because there were schools they didn't normally work with and certainly didn't compete with. Didn't always work well, but there were enough examples of that as a process of working with schools, doing these kind of peer inquiry visits and so on. And I mean, in thinking about what could be done in England, I think we need to go back to some of those successes and say, we've a long record of networking. Go back to Excellence in Cities,
yeah.
EAZs, the Leadership Incentive Grant.
Mm,
There are lots of people in the system who know how to network and how to work with schools, but the system is so perverse and has kind of created sets of barriers about all of
yeah.
that. But I think that's the way forward, really. We've got to
Mm,
create a more collaborative working environment, and we've got to cross borders, I think. I mean, borders between local authorities, borders between faith schools, even private schools, got to
yes.
bring the thing together somehow. And it's radical, of course.
Yeah.
Frank and I have spoken quite often about changing the way we evaluate schools so
Yeah.
that we actually look at a group of schools
Yeah.
as a group, as
Yeah.
a community, and say, what's it like to be a child in this community?
That's
And
right.
then go wider, hopefully, and look at health, etc. And so, can you imagine saying, well, the schools are going to be judged on the reduction in social issues?
Yeah. Yeah.
That would be
Yeah.
something that schools would have to go, wow, we need to think differently.
Yeah.
If antisocial behaviour is going to affect the way people think about our school in the area, they
Yeah.
might not be our kids, but we need to work together to do something about it.
I think that reminds me of the importance of local coordination.
Yeah.
The collapse of the local authority
Yeah.
over successive governments. I'm not arguing to return to the traditional local authority, but there has to be something that is the conscience of the system,
Absolutely.
that has the big picture and that steps in if the system is colluding with itself to disadvantage some of our learners and some of our families. There has to be some kind of local
Yeah.
coordination.
It's
Or
funny.
even the administration of things like that needs somebody
Yeah.
outside of all of the schools to be
Yeah.
able to just.
And we still have local authorities that retained a capacity, even when there are lots of, like there's one county authority I've worked with recently, and their claim is they've got one of everything. They've got grammar schools, they've got this, that, and the other, but they've held it together. They have a strategy of school leaders who, and it's a quite spread county, who work together to make sure that we get the best out of all the resources available. I think that radical step is essential in my view.
It's funny. Mel's thinking influenced a piece that I wrote for Schools Week probably about a year ago, but actually going that there needed to be somebody in a locality who actually saw fairness, oversaw the sort of ensured that the system was well oiled, shall we say, that
That's right.
that schools were not able to simply just say, well, we're just going to be concerned about our children and
Yeah.
we're going to do it our way without it thinking about they're in an ecosystem here, and
Yeah.
it's a service that we're providing. And so I think that there is a place for that independent voice
Yeah.
to hold
Yeah.
people to account for that
Wouldn't it be
collaboration.
great if they were elected by the schools?
I agree. I think they
It's
should
not
be
somebody
appointed by the
dropped in.
schools.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it shouldn't be a government appointment. It shouldn't be for the mayors to decide on that. I think that needs to have the trust of the people who are
Yes,
actually involved
absolutely.
in the system. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, That's the first. We've done 197 of these, Mel. That's the first time we've not done what's caught your eye this week.
Can
Apart
I just Can I just
yeah,
show,
you do your
because
one.
this does fit in with the looking at things differently.
It does.
It's just an example I wanted to share because it's one of those you can smile at afterwards. Last night we had torrential rain for a good half hour just as I was about to go out. So I spent my time whinging and moaning and pacing up and down and looking out and thinking the world ready for Noah and his ark coming past. And I was really depressed about the weather and angry about the weather. And I got this via WhatsApp. And it made me think maybe some people see things a little bit differently.
Just
Hang
move it
on.
around a little bit. That's the way.
See outside. What's outside? A rainbow. A rainbow. A big rainbow.
Oh,
Enormous rainbow. Have it.
Oh gosh. Well,
There's definitely a different way of seeing the weather.
yeah. Well, thank you, Mel.
it's a pleasure.
And thank you, Stan. And we'd love to have you back now. I mean, I think this for us is
Next week.
great
Right.
professional development. Yeah. But I'll send you a date, and you know it would be great for you to join us again. So thank you for that, and thank you, Stan. And we're back next week. We have a few more editions before our 200th edition. If things work out correctly, we've got a big name for our 200th, even bigger than Professor Mel Ainscow.
Oh, really?
So let's see if that materialises. But anyway, all being well, see you all next week. Thank you. Bye bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.